So first of all, good evening, everyone. Secondly, I was just speaking to someone before I logged in here about fasting. I know the Rav put out a video just this morning in both Hebrew and in English about his opinion concerning these fast days that we just had one of them just now. It's now tonight is the 11th of Tevet. I remember when I first met the Rav, the first time I met him in person was he was still giving the shiur. This is before anything was put on YouTube. Certainly, this was before the Zoom era, and it so happened that shiur, normally there was a few regular guys there, but they weren't there that week. That was the one week I showed up, and he was recording quite a long shiur on quite a long series, basically on this sugya. And that's what I was getting from him. I knew that he was always hinting about the selective nature of these fast days. And I thought, yeah, that's very important. I myself happen to fast because I believe that where I live, because most people are fasting and they're unaware of the whole sugya and all that, it's wrong for one person to exempt himself from a fast when other people in the community are fasting. As a matter of fact, in some Sfarim, like in the Shulchan Aruch, they call someone basically a poresh min hatzibur if he were to do something like that. So I try not to. I try not to eat on a fast day when everybody else is, and I try to keep the fast. Secondly, I had an experience a few years ago when my daughter was born, also on a Surah B'Tevet. I was ill. I had a stomach issue that did not allow me to fast. And I felt bad about that. I said that, God willing, I should be healthy again. And God gave me my health, and I took upon myself, I don't want to miss any fast days, because fasting is sometimes you do it right, it's good for you. Basically, we've seen what the Rambam says, why it is we have these fast days. They're supposed to be modeled after Yom Kippur. And I like to say, paraphrase the Rambam in English in 3 easy words: inspiration through starvation. It's a good thing. I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, but that's basically what it's supposed to be. It's good for you to take some time, and sometimes even to take on a fast for various reasons. Chazal have a concept of Tanit Chalom, for example. That's a very good thing, and it helps. It helps the soul. Now let's look at some loose ends from last shiur, because we had some questions and answers. I don't think I made it clear enough. Last week I said that Gentiles have no regulations regarding ritual impurity. It is Goyim don't have the rules of Tuma and Tara, which means that with regards to them visiting the Temple Mount for our purposes, they don't really have a restriction except for that which Chazal mandated, which is they can't go beyond the Chil. But it's not like they have to undergo any ritual purifications to do so. And I forgot to mention, but this is an important point, that Chazal decreed impurity on Gentiles and Gentile women, etc. That doesn't mean that they now have the ability to purify themselves in certain means. Instead, it means that they can contaminate us, but it doesn't mean that they themselves have any impurity or any other such purity or rules like that they could then modify by, for example, going to a mikveh. So one of the major nafkaminos is that Chazal said because they wanted to keep Jews from mingling with Gentiles, which is a very important thing. So Chazal said, for example, that Gentile women impart impurity on Jewish men. That doesn't mean that the Gentilist woman can go to, let's say, the mikveh and remove that impurity from herself. That can't happen. Whatever impurity they have is not necessarily intrinsic, but more like that they impart it to us, and there's nothing they could do to remove that ability to impart contamination. So I hope that makes it clear, and if there's more questions about it, we could deal with that afterwards. The second thing, I sort of froze last shiur. I said the word, I was trying to find the right word, and I said tantamount. Tantamount means something becomes equal to another. I meant to say paramount, and I just couldn't. That's why I said that's not the right word at the time. I forgot what word I was trying to get, but then right after shiur, I said, it was paramount. So I clearly made a note, so you see that over there. Also, this was something that was bothering me also after last shiur. The Rambam doesn't say it explicitly in the passage we saw at the beginning, which was from Perusha Mishnayot to that first chapter of Kelim, where the sages mentioned who can go where, or up until what point everybody can go within Jerusalem and on the Temple Mount. And the assumption is that a Baal Keri, that is like I said at the beginning, a Jewish man who's experienced a seminal emission for whatever reason, may not go onto the Temple Mount. And once he's gone to mikvah, that very day, he can go up to a certain point, and afterwards he can go even farther, assuming he's not a Tamei Meith, or assuming he's not permitted to go beyond that point in the situations where Tamei Meith is allowed complete access to the temple. Even technically speaking, the Kohen Gadol, if he's a Tamei Meith on Yom Kippur and everybody else is also to Tamei Meith, which means they're also being contaminated with contact with the dead, so we just go ahead with whatever service. That's called Tumah Hutra B'tzibur or Dechuya B'tzibur. And the funny thing is that also in the Mishnah Torah, this seems to be Rambam's assumption when we see the corresponding passage in B'choth Beitha Bechira, where the Rambam mostly quotes this Gemara as we know it, this Mishnah as we know it, which describes where everybody can go on the Temple Mount. He doesn't say it explicitly. He doesn't say that, oh yeah, and by the way, a Baal Keri is not allowed on the Temple Mount. And in Hilchot Biaf Mikdash also, it's not so clear to someone reading it, although soon we will see that actually it is mentioned in Biaf Mikdash, but you have to know where to look. In Biaf Mikdash, the Rambam gives a similar summation of the laws of who can go where. It's kind of funny that he separated the two. Basically, he introduces the laws of Biaf Mikdash there in Beit Bechira, and then he goes into more details and also the punishments involved in Biaf Mikdash. So that would be in the 3rd chapter. So this basic assumption that a Baal Keri cannot enter the Temple Mount is explicit in a verse in Deuteronomy. That would be 23:11. That's a Sefer Devarim. It says when you have a person or a man who is not tahor because of Mikarei Laila, something that happened at night, and some people think that this has to be like, let's say, an unwitting seminal emission, but really that's just the expression. It means also if it was on purpose, it was even a mitzvah perhaps. Be that as it may, someone who has this impurity, he will go out of the camp. And then it says lo yavo al tocha machaneh, which is a little bit redundant, but of course, if there is a redundancy, the sages learned much from that. Here, this seems to be a positive commandment. He shall go out. Lo yavo al tocha machaneh, he shall not go back into the camp or not enter the camp. It says here, he's in the camp, which means that even if he's outside the camp, he was already outside the camp, or he left the camp after he became impure, he cannot go back into the camp. So the Rambam says this. First of all, there's a positive commandment. This is according to his count, mitzvah 31. And he says that leaving the camp, for example, what it says in Bamidbar, in Parashat Naso, it says, yes, leave Machane Shchina, which, as we saw, meant in tabernacle times, let's say in the times of Moses, it meant that a person was not allowed within the courtyard of the Mishkan. The Mishkan simply consisted of the Olam Moed, one structure, and then a courtyard around it, which is defined by the curtains that were held up by poles and went all around the Mishkan, if I'm not mistaken, a 50 by 100 amma area. And immediately beyond that was the camp of the Levites, where they actually had their camp. And we saw last week that the camp of the Levites in the wilderness corresponds to the rest of the Temple Mount today. Since they built the temple, it corresponds to the Temple Mount and hasn't changed. And the camp of the Israelites, which surrounded the camp of the Levites, that corresponds to the rest of Jerusalem. So here it says positively that has to go beyond Machane Shechina, the inner courtyard, what it would be now, the inner courtyard of the temple, as we saw. The Machane Shechina only includes the inner courtyard of the temple, not the second courtyard, the outer courtyard immediately to the east, separated from the main courtyard by the Nicanor gate. That's what we call the women's courtyard, as Rath Nashim. And beyond that is the rest of the Temple Mount. Those are both considered Levitic camp, stage 2. So in this positive commandment, we see that the Baal Keri, see here of the pasuk here, this is Deuteronomy 23:11. This person who is impure because of a Mikarei Laila leaves the camp, and we say that it's Machane Shechina. So that means there's a positive commandment for the Baal Keri to leave, or at least not go in there, but it's not a negative commandment. So it has to be a positive commandment that he be sent out by whoever's in charge from the inner courtyard. So that's just the positive injunction to remove any impure person from the inner courtyard. And then it's the mitzvah lo tha'aseh, the negative commandment, or as Rabbi Kruger said back in, I think it was sixth grade, he called it a thou shalt not. I thought that was humorous, so I included it here, a thou shalt not, number 78. So the Rambam says here, the prohibition, lo yavo el tocha machaneh. See, here's the pasuk again. It refers to Tamei Mikre Laila, who is sent out of Machaneh Liviyah, which, like the Rambam says, Kamo Ledoroth is Harabayith. So that pasuk, Deuteronomy 23:11, the pshat is, according to the Rambam, when he talks about the mitzvot, and he brings, by the way, midrash halacha. Last week I was trying to find the word. Also, I said midrash haggadah, and I corrected myself. So he brings the Sifri describes this. You have to take, this person has a prohibition of entering the camp. In this case, the camp is not the camp of the Shekhinah, but the camp of the Leviyah, and it says it explicitly. We learn about all the other people who are contaminated from the person who has Tumath Keri. He has to leave the camp, and in this case, the camp is the Levitic camp, which corresponds to Har Bayith. So here we see in the book of Miswoth, and seems to be the Pshat in the Pasuk, it's in the Sifrei, that the Baal Keri has to leave Har Bayith. He cannot go there. And by the way, if you study the Sugyan Psachim 67 to 68, those are the relevant pages, Rashi also says this explicitly. But Rashi's not the Rambam. Rashi did not write a Sefer Halacha. He didn't write a code that we use all the time. It's much harder to derive bottom line Halacha from Rashi. Although Rashi, it's very funny. I like to tell students that you can learn Halacha by studying how Rashi comments on the Torah and on the Talmud. And you could learn how Rambam commented or understood Talmud and Torah by how he formulates the halacha. They go hand in hand, and basically the basis of our Talmud study starts with Rashi, and it culminates with seeing the bottom line halacha from the Rambam. I find the two most important Rishonim that we have to know when we're younger. Familiarize yourself with everything they say. So this brings us to another point about going into Har Bayith. Just today, news broke, or was it yesterday, of a group of young men who were basically disguising themselves as pious Muslims, learning the different customs and practices of Muslims who go to pray on Har Bayith, and they were basically infiltrating. They were trying to disguise themselves so they could go up on Har Bayith. And there were certain reactions, many of them political. I'd like to say that for those who know me, I have photographic evidence of this. For many years, when they were preventing Jews from going on Har Bayith, period, especially on our mourning days like Asura B'Tevet and Tisha B'Av, I myself was trying to get onto Har Bayith, and I remember waiting in the sun with Rabbi Yisrael Ariel and Rabbi Lior and other celebrities. By celebrities, I don't mean any disrespect. I mean the real leaders of the Jewish people. And in those years, they sometimes just decided no Jews are going to be allowed in Har Bayith. And in those years, I basically took a polo shirt, and I wore a polo shirt and blue jeans, and of course wearing Crocs, so those don't look too dressy. And I wore a novelty cowboy hat and carried a bottle of water with me, so that I could enter Har Bayith with Christian groups, or if they weren't Christian, at least Gentiles were just visiting. Usually Gentiles from abroad basically speak English, and I speak English, and I could pretend to be one of them. And that is for 3 years straight. Well, I don't know if it was straight, but 3 years I was able to enter Har Bayith that way. I sort of regret it now, and I'll explain why, but I was able to enter Har Bayith, and then twice I was able to just go to the Eastern Gate and pray on my own. Those are the places where they have the minyanim nowadays. So I was able to go there and pray and prostrate and do whatever I wanted to do for a while. And that was good, but it was unfortunate because I had to basically hide. And I remember pretending going through the security that I did not speak any Hebrew, or at least didn't understand it. And even sometimes the police realized, oh, yeah, but you see this guy's ID says Grossman, he's from New York. But I looked like a secular Jew, and then they let me get away with it. And the last time I did this, basically I was on my way out. I was already on the northern side of Har Bayith, proceeding westward like we normally do. And one of those horrible people up there who prevent us from praying, one of those Waqf guys, may God remove them speedily in our days, noticed me. And I wasn't praying, I was just walking. and he starts screaming in Hebrew to the Israeli police people that, look at this guy, there's a Jew you're just letting go around on their own. And they said, no, he's not Jew. He went up with the other people. And then they said, the Arabs said to them, yeah, but look at the guy, he's a Jew. And indeed, I don't think I could disguise the fact on Tisha B'Av, after, right at the end of the 3 weeks, just because I'm wearing a polo shirt and blue jeans and a cowboy hat and carrying a bottle of water, for some reason I look very Jewish. And the Jews couldn't notice that. They just look at the bottle of water, which I wasn't drinking, of course. It's just a prop. I didn't think I even broke the seal on the bottle of water. But the Arabs could see that. And it's because they know the power of our prayer. Their whole point is that they know something that we all know, and that is, if tomorrow, and the Vilna Gaon wrote about this, if tomorrow the Jews decide, that's it, we're doing the Korban Tamid, we're going to reinstitute the temple service and start rebuilding the temple, we will succeed. So these fellows who are doing this, I don't think it is in a Geula fashion, or as the Rav would say, a redemption mode Judaism. It says that when the Israelites left Egypt, they were Yotzeim Biyad Ramah. They went with a hand held high. And God referred to that event as Wa'olech Etchem Komem Youth. I led you ahead, standing upright, after he broke the yoke of the Egyptians. Those are basically referring to the same thing, that there's Jewish pride in the redemption. And I think this movement, of course, I think they were doing this as a ruse, because then they alerted the media to this so they could basically get attention. That's what one of their ringleaders, Raphael Morris, who's a great Jew, who's been crusading for I wouldn't say the right, that's a Western word. He's crusading for the duty of the Jews to restart the sacrificial service. He comes from a long line of good Askanim. His father's an Askan for Am Yisrael, does a lot of chesed. His grandfather, Rabbi Kestenbaum, has done a lot for the Jewish people. And I'm not talking like the bad political Askanim who are there just to put people in cherem. I'm talking about Askanim who are really working on behalf of Klal Yisrael. So he comes from the right place. I think that what they're doing is right, but it lacks a certain sense of Jewish pride. I really believe that, and this is an answer to last week's question, if we were to have every single day going up to Har Bayit 1,000 of 2,000 Jews who would insist on praying as they are supposed to, and I mean according to halacha and with talit and tefillin, and they are going to prostrate themselves, they couldn't possibly rest everybody. Every now and then you see that there's a youth who screams Shema Yisrael or something or other, another line of prayer, and prostrates himself on Har Bayit, and then they immediately arrest him. If all 20 people with him would do the same thing, they couldn't arrest all of them. They don't have enough manpower. Oh, of course they'll close Har Bayit. But then if 2,000 people are demanding to get on every single day, and that's what they're going to do, and they will not be stopped, then they will not be stopped. And if you're going to say, yeah, but the Arabs are going to mass, they're going to do that shtick that they pulled, I think it was 2 years ago on Tisha B'Av, where they said they're going to close every mosque in the city and not let anybody go into the mosque and say, put them all in Har Bayit. They could pull that shtick once a year maybe, but they'll get tired of it because they really don't care enough about Har Bayit. They don't have enough people going there to pray on a regular basis. There aren't that many of them who really care about this. Like we could get Am Yisrael on a regular basis to come by the thousands every single day. And that's why I think it's very important. If tomorrow, like I said, we have enough people to do that, then we would already be there. And that's what we have to do. We have to get that critical mass of Jews, just like a Jewish state was able to happen because God saw that enough Jews want to be in on it. Once we get a critical mass, we could do it. And I think there's mystical ideas about the number 600,000. Those are for other people. I don't deal with Nigla. I don't deal with Nistar. I just deal with Nigla. So the question is, why didn't Rambam mention this fact in the Mishnah Torah that a Baal Keri is not allowed on Har Bayit? Of course, before you study Mishnah Torah and the Halachot, you're supposed to read Sefer HaMisvot, which is basically the introduction to the Mishnah Torah. But he basically does. In Biath Mikdash 3:8, he says this. It says about the Tamei HaMeshulach B'Har Bayit, a Tamei who's expelled from Har Bayit, Im Nichnas Over B'Lo Taseh. If he does go into the Har Bayit, he has violated a negative commandment, or thou shalt not, and he is lashed. Shneimar V'Yosel Michus L'Machaneh. He shall go to beyond the camp. Zeh Machaneh Shechina. V'Lo Yovel Tochel Machaneh Zeh Machaneh Livyan. Here Rambam basically is summarized the two commandments which he wrote about earlier, positive commandment 31, negative commandment 78. And this is the verse, is that very verse in Deuteronomy. And he didn't bring you the beginning of it, where he was referring to a person who is tamei mikare laila. And from the person who's balkari, we learn all the other about what should be the rule regarding everybody else who is tamei. So it is in the Mishnah Torah that a balkari cannot go on Har HaBayit. The Rambam here basically was assuming you know what he said in Sefer HaMitzvot, that this is learned from the balkari. So there you go. That was the assumption of what we were working with last week. We should have started this year with that, but better late than never. And I also have to think, I was looking at this Mosei Shabbat. I found that the Koren Steinsaltz edition put out by Shefa, which I did not work on at all, although I did do some other work for Koren a few years ago. They actually make a note of this. They show some sources. They bring it. It's actually a machloketh. I don't think that the other side is based well enough. And also, Michlel Herzog has a wonderful website called dot.ac.il, which has, for example, Rav Kapach's edition of the Sefer HaMitzvot available in its entirety, which I use, so I'm giving them credit for that. They also put on the entire Rav Kapach's translation of Mor Nevuchim, which is something that if you are an adult Jewish man, I hope that you have had time to review at least once and understand, along with the Kuzari and the rest of them, Mesilas Yesharim, Orchos Tzadikim, Chovos HaLevavos. You can't understand basic Jewish thought without reading those books at least once and understanding them. And I'm sure there's a few more that go in there. I'm sorry if I forgot them, but you should definitely familiarize yourself with it. Now let's go back to why is it jumping? That was just weird. I think the screen ghosted for a second. It's like someone scrolled it for me. We're going to go back to Rabbi Brand's sources. Rabbi Brand was basically, his thesis was similar to the one that I had. I was actually provoked by reading this first mimer and trying to find other proofs to Rabbi Brand's essential contention, which is that not just in Maimonidean language, but even in Shas itself, signed out because your account is signed in from another device. Yoshua, do you still see me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm getting a thing that I'm signed out because my account is signed in from another device, but that's not interfering with us. I don't want to click OK because I'm afraid I'm going to lose you. So
it could be that you're also logged in on a phone, or someone else is using your account.
I think no, it's actually different than that. I got my computer back from the shop yesterday, and just then it stopped working again. I'm using my wife's computer, so it could be that the Rebbitzin is using it right now. She normally has a live or something, so I might be logged in as her. I think, yeah, that's it. I logged in as her. Now she's logged in as herself somewhere else, so that would be okay. As long as you could still see me, we're going on. I'm not going to stop this.
Back to you.
So Rabbi Brand's, like I said, his argument is that the Rambam says this and Shas says this. This is Chazal, that Har HaBayis is Beis HaMikdash. So he brings us proof over here. The Gemara Brachos, another point, but we start with Brachos also, where it talks about prayer on Har HaBayis and prayer in the Beis HaMikdash. The Rambam equates the two. Here in Daf Samach Beis, he says that the halacha is that whoever spits on Har HaBayis, whoever just happens to spit on the ground, even if it's like at the corner on the earth there, it says Ki'ilu rokek bivate. No, it's like he's spitting in his own eye. It's an act of grave disrespect. Shneimar v'hayu einai v'libi sham kol hayamim. The pasuk, which they only cite the beginning of it, at the end of it, but before it says God is telling Shlomo HaMelech that He has chosen this house forever. He says this house, Habayit Hazeh, and He says my eyes and my heart will be there, kol hayamim, forever. So that's basically saying that Chazal said God was talking about this house, this temple. And Chazal said, yeah, it's Har HaBayis. So you see that there's an equation there. The last one is an interesting one. We're not going to see the entire details, but over here I highlighted it. It talks about Hillel attending the Simchas Beis HaShoeva and talking about if I'm here, then everybody's here, and if I'm not here, then nobody's here. He gives Rashi's Perush, and the Maharsha disagreed with that. He gave his own Perush, and this is what Rabbi Brand points out. V'im Yisrael Enokan, Mikan, the Gam Shriat Shechina Enokan, saying if Am Yisrael doesn't go to the Beit HaMikdash, then there will not be Hashras Shechina, there won't be a manifestation of the divine presence there. This is Rabbi Brand's words over here in the third paragraph. The first paragraph is from Chazal. This second paragraph is from the Maharsha. We'll leave this, Yoshua will make this available to everybody after this year. And here is what Rabbi Brand pointed out. He says, Im ein Yisrael olim lamikdash, which he says, Harabayith, Shagam Zenik Rabbeith HaBechira, and he gives other proofs. I saved this for the last. We've already now seen that this thesis has been proven. HaKadosh Baruch Hu lo nimtza b'Beit HaMikdash haynu b'Harabayith. That is, if the Jews stay away from Harabayith, then it, so to speak, drives away the divine presence from Harabayith. And if the Jews do go to Harabayith, it's as though inviting the divine presence there. Rabbi Yisrael Ariel has a list of 5 commandments that are fulfilled. You didn't see my 5th finger. 5 commandments that we fulfill by going and visiting Harabayith. Lav dafka, because not everybody could fulfill it. We'll hopefully see that some other time. But the point is well taken, that if we neglect Harabayith, then it is though we're basically saying there should be no divine presence there. If there is a divine presence, then the most basic commandment is l'shechno tidrishu v'atashama. You should seek out his abode, and you shall go there. And Rabbi Brand continues. It says, "Harabayith nikra beit mikdash k'mavar kam b'marsha shakavana b'makom shmutar le'azkirat Hashem." It says, "B'chol makom asher azkirat shmi avo elechu ve'rachticha." It seems that Harabayith is in its entirety, it is the Beit HaMikdash itself, because on Harabayith, that's where we're allowed to say God's ineffable name. God's name is spelled, as you know, Yud Hey Vav Hey, but our tradition has been, the sages mention this, that we do not pronounce it. It used to be they did pronounce it more often. Eventually, it was saying limited to the services in the temple, and they gradually phased it out, such that even it used to be one of the last times they were saying it was at the recitation of the priestly blessing every day. The Kohanim would bless the people, and it says that when Shimon HaTzadik died, they stopped doing it. They started using Shem Avnuth, which is one of the God's names already since Maaseh Bereshith. It's one of the first names of God, along with Shem Elohuth, Aleph Lamed Hey Yud Mem, or its other construct forms like God of Israel, etc., or our God. And they started using the Shem Avnuth, the pronunciation thereof, also for what they call the Shem Havayah, the 4-letter name. But it seems that they continued saying God's name as it was. Who's they? The Kohen Gadol. He himself would say it, but it was disguised. There's some given shot that the Kohen Gadol would do something so that it would not be heard when he said it, during his confession on Yom Kippur, or I think more accurately, I think this is the way the Rambam has it, the other Kohanim would sing melodies in order to drown out what the Kohen Gadol was saying, so that people did not hear him pronounce God's name. So that was the limitation that was at least in the temple service. But those were 2 incidences, the priestly blessing and the service of Yom Kippur. Those were both performed in the inner courtyard of the temple, which of course is the temple. But Rabbi Brand brings here, this Gemara over here from Masechet Sotah, that even when the Kohanim would pronounce the priestly blessing elsewhere on the Temple Mount, as they do today, for example, even then they would pronounce God's name as written. Of course, like we said, after the death of Shimon HaTzadik, which is a few centuries before the Second Temple was destroyed, he lived at the beginning of the Second Temple times, they stopped doing so. But technically speaking, before that point, that's what they did. And if they had pronounced the priestly blessing beyond the inner courtyard, they would still be in the right to say God's name as written. And by the way, don't try to say God's name as written. You're forbidden from doing so. One of the good things is that most people do not know the proper nikud thereof. It's not the nikud you see that appears in your Siddur or other books. That nikud basically tells you to pronounce it the Shem Adnut. It's the nikud for that we say it's a chataf patach, a chulam, and a kamatz. That's the nikud for the Shem Adnut. And sometimes it's pronounced as Shem Elahut. So the nikud once again is a chataf segol, chulam, and a chirik. That has nothing to do with the Shem Hashem. And I find I take comfort in the fact that even if someone were to, let's say, write out God's name in front of us with the proper nikud, because most people don't know how to pronounce the vowels the right way. For example, segol is itself its own subject to dispute. We've seen a few shitot about how to pronounce the kamats the right way. Just those two vowels alone, if either of them were to occur in God's name, and the fact that most people don't pronounce a vav like a consonant, we're pronouncing our vav like a vet, that would basically prevent the vast majority of even scholars from being able to pronounce God's name right, even if someone were to write it out in front of their face. So we're not going to say it, but the point is still that we say God's name on Har Habayit because all of Har Habayit is the Beit HaMikdash, and hopefully things will go back to the way they should be. We will restore and not only the service, but also the fact that God's name will be exclaimed by his priests in his house, speeding our days. I mentioned last week also that the anti-Semites need no excuse to do whatever they do. As a matter of fact, I think that we've seen it the opposite. When Jews show strength, then they get more respect. That's why another point about this, these people disguising themselves as Arabs, I think they're coming from a point of weakness. If they would show strength, I think they'd get a lot more success. Although we should also make note, they didn't do anything violent to anybody. They didn't do anything that should be even a crime. Part of the thing that they were saying was that, see, look at this we have to sneak in order to pray, and the people call them criminals or inciting violence. What kind of incitement is this, that they dressed like people and they went up and prayed, they bowed down, and they made sure not to make a scene? It's the exact opposite of what they're being accused of. Now let's get to of seeking out Har Habayit, and this involves a comparison. For those who can, I recommend getting out a Tanakh and making a note of the structure of these passages in Samuel and the corresponding chapters, beginning with the first book of Chronicles, chapter 11, going on for quite a few chapters after that. So you see that in Samuel, which is, I would say, like the authorized edition. It's part of the Nevi'im. Nevi'im take precedence over Ketuvim, which is just the other writings. And there we have the events of David's coronation, how he became king of all of Israel. All the tribes accepted him. And then a few events. And the order is not so clear. Obviously, there are things that are out of order. Why? Because the first thing we see is that David conquered Jerusalem, but not even a military conquest. More like they invaded the city, and basically the Jebusites who were still there surrendered to David, and he made that his capital. That's after he was anointed king of over all of Israel. And then we see Hiram, king of Tzor, king of Tyre, recognized David as king and actually sent him tribute. And then there's a list of David's children born to his various wives. But this case, it doesn't mention all the wives by name like it did in the first list of the children he had while he was still living in Hebron, when he was just king of the tribe of Judah. And you see that Solomon is on the list, and also apparently sons born after that. And we know Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, was one of David's younger children. So this passage obviously is not in its chronological place. So that's passage 3. Passage 4 is that we read about how the Philistines basically attempted to remove David from power when they heard that he had become king over all of Israel. So they attacked him, and there's a few battles mentioned there. And then we read about how David attempted first to finally move the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. It had been in storage basically in Kiriath Yarim. Basically the entire time that Shmuel Navi was leading the Jewish people, and the entire reign of Saul and his son Ishbosheth. And only then David decided, okay, now it's time to bring the ark to Jerusalem. As I said in earlier Shurim, note very carefully that David did not say, let us bring the ark to where the tabernacle was in Giv'on. That's where I would have thought he did it, because the Mishkan was there, and that's where the temple service was being performed. That was considered the temple at the time. But instead, he wanted to remove the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem in preparation, apparently, for building the temple, although it's not explicit, which just goes to show that the Ark of the Covenant is not an essential feature of a temple, and Nov and Givon were precedents, therefore, and also the entire Second Temple time, basically. There was no Ark of the Covenant, and even the first temple times, they removed the Ark of the Covenant. It did not affect the status of the temple in any way. but he tried to bring it to Jerusalem. And as we know, this is the Haftarah, and the 1 year cycle, at least, for Parashat Shmini. And Uzzah died when he tried to stabilize the ark on its wagon, and God smote him there. So David left the ark with Oved Edom, who, as we read in Sefer Divrei Yamim Chronicles, was a prominent Levite. And a few months later, after David saw that God had blessed Oved Edom, the sages say he was blessed with a lot of children and grandchildren, and those are also listed in Divrei Yamim. That's when he brought the ark to Jerusalem. And then it says, this is an important verse, when the king sat in his home, Ki yashav hamelech bebeito, and then it says, V'Hashem einiach lo miseviv. Hashem had given him rest all around from his enemies. And he told the prophet Nathan, okay, I'd like permission. I have an idea. Let's build a temple, permanent temple to God. And the prophet basically agreed, but then was given a message by God. No, you have to tell him to hold off on that. Let his son do so. For whatever reason, he should not do so. Now, as I pointed out earlier, Hashem hiniach lo misaviv, there's no vava yipuch here, which means that God had. This is past perfect. It means that previously God had given him his rest from his enemies. So that means that this is something, this fact that David enjoyed peace preceded this whole point where David wanted to build the temple. And this whole idea they wanted to build a temple is apparently something that happened shortly after he had succeeded in bringing the ark to Jerusalem. This is the order of the parashiyot we have in the book of Shmuel. Note this number, note the numbers I gave them. In the book of Chronicles, the order is changed. We start with the conquest of Jerusalem, then a list of David's warriors and supporters. David's warriors actually is almost verbatim, with the usual changes that Divrei Yamim makes, to a later list we find in the book of Shmuel. That would be Samuel. And then we see David's supporters. What was David's supporters? The Divrei Yamim emphasizes this much more than the Sefer Shmuel does, that since David originally ran away from Saul, he became the leader of a ragtag group. First, it was his brothers and cousins, and then various other people, until he was the leader of hundreds of people. And by the time there was a movement to make him king of all Israel, he had supporters from all the tribes. Tens of thousands of people from all the other tribes came to Hebron to basically coronate him, make him the king over all of Israel. It's interesting to note that list, all the people from the different tribes. And then it starts with, after his supporters, David attempts to move the ark to Jerusalem, but leaves it Oved Edom. See, we jump to section 5. And then we get that Hiram recognized David. Once again, that lists David's children after his move to Jerusalem. The Philistines attempt to remove David from power, and then David brings the ark to Jerusalem, actually succeeded. It is my belief that this change in Divrei Yamim reflects the actual order in which the events happened, because of this critical verse over here that we have in the book of Shmuel. Shmuel is not necessarily trying to tell us things in the order in which they happened. I think the most important point is that in between David's first attempt to bring the ark to Jerusalem, leaving it at Oved Edom's house, and when he actually succeeded in bringing it to Jerusalem, we have this war with the Philistines, that they tried to remove him from power. And it was only then that David realized, okay, aside from the fact that God has blessed Oved Edom, now it's time of peace. There's been an attempted overthrow or attempted destabilization by our enemies, but now that we have peace, we can continue with this. And God willing, we'll try to bring more proofs to this assertion of mine. But for now, I'd like to focus on this key word over here. One of the things that's added by Sefer Divrei Yamim in the book of Chronicles is that before David decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, it says he took counsel. He took counsel with these the heads, the captains of the thousands and the hundreds, all the people in charge, all the commanders. Or David, he told the entire community of Israel, if you think it's good, and also if God will give us help, nifritzah, let's break through. In this case means show some omets. Nishlecha alachenu hanisharim b'chol artzot Yisrael. Let us send to all our brethren who remain, or the remaining ones, in all the lands of Israel, and including them, including Kohanim and Leviim in their respective Kohanic cities and Levitic cities, and gather them to us. And that's when we'll bring the Ark of the Covenant to us. So this word Hanisharim is the key word. For me, especially, I was noticing when I was reading this, I saw three major interpretations of this word Nisharim. Well, the first one, which I preferred based on something else, God willing, we'll have a share about that, was those still in the land of Israel. This has been forgotten, but there was a Machon Shilo, and it's hinted at in Sefer Shmuel that resulted in Jews going into exile. It's explicit in the book of Shmuel, right at the end of what's called Shmuel Aleph, because that's what the printers decided. After Saul and his older sons fell in battle in Har Gilboa, many Jews picked up and left. They ran away from the Philistines, who took over their cities. That was in the Galil, and they ran away. They basically went into exile. It's also hinted at in the very prayer which David established for them to say when they brought this Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, and he set up a sort of shrine there in the city of David. Many people are familiar with this passage, which has now been brought into the Sidurim. It's the Hodu Lashem Kiru Vishmo section that comes from Divrei Yamim. It's basically a combination of two other psalms which you find in with slight changes that also we've discussed before. And it says that critical verse at the end, rescue us or save us, the God of our salvation, and gather us in among the nations. So why is David giving a prayer for this? And there was other similar lines in Tehillim which correspond to his time. It's because Jews went into exile. Not everybody, but just like we saw with other destructions of the temple, it resulted in Jews going to exile. So too, the destruction of Shiloh and the tumultuous times that ensued until the rise of King David, and ultimately we got to the peak in the times of King Solomon. Jews were in exile, and there was interest. Nikabetz Hashem is Nikabetz Nidchei Yisrael, and similar lines are in the Tehillim. David HaMelech was just talking about that there was an idea that we have to rescue the Jews from the Galuth, bring them back to the land of Israel. So part of his plan is first gather up the Jews who are Nisharim in Artzot Yisrael, as opposed to those Jews who are in exile. We have to first gather up the ones who are still here. Even though it's probably millions, still, he calls them the Nisharim. More mild interpretations being it means those who remained at home and didn't join David. Like I said, there was a list of his supporters. So the ones who are Nisharim are not the ones who were enthusiastic, or the ones who actually came by the tens of thousands to be there at David's at the anointing ceremony, the coronation, and making him king over all Israel. And in Daf Mikra, they pointed out that no, it could be the unconquered lands. It's a little bit iffy, but the language allows for this. David was basically saying, let us complete the conquest of the promised land that had so far gone uncompleted. Since the times of Joshua, there had been places where they should have conquered, and the sages actually talk about this a lot more in the Gemara, especially in Gittin and other places. The Rambam discusses this halacha. What is considered land of Israel? What has holiness? Where do the mitzvot apply? It turns out that they didn't finish the conquest, and David actually, even though he did finally finish the conquest, he did it in the wrong order. There are places that were technically not promised land they conquered first before he finished the conquest of that which he was supposed to have conquered. So that's considered kibush yachid. That's also beyond the scope of what we're discussing now. But the point is, that's what the word nisharim, they interpret it. I mean, so let's go over those three. Those Jews who were still in the land of Israel, as opposed to those who went to exile, those who remained at home and didn't come for David's coronation. And it's referring to perhaps those unconquered lands. But all these show us something very important. And that is that David believed that this act of bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem first, before even asking for permission to build a temple, what would he be doing? The sanctuary is already at Givon. The Ark is in Kiriath Yearim. And if his intention is to build a temple in Jerusalem, I would have thought, just like Bitzalel, Rashi brings the famous midrash that Bitzalel was told by Moses, build this tabernacle, build the Ark of the Covenant, then build the tabernacle. And he said, that makes no sense. If you were building a tabernacle to house this Ark of the Covenant, you have to build the tabernacle first. And that's the order when he actually did it in. So too, the place that's supposed to house the Ark should precede the Ark. So if the Ark is already find where it is, and it was fine in it seems Oved Edom. It seems that who is the house of Beit Avinadav, if I'm not mistaken. Who was the Levi who was in charge in Kiryat Yearim before Oved Edom for 40 something years? Apparently, he was in charge of the Ark of the Covenant, or not 40 years, perhaps it's less than that, 17 years away. Because I'll describe it depends on how long Saul actually reigned and how long Shmuel Navi was in charge. Whatever time that was, the Ark of the Covenant seemed to be just fine. I would have thought that based on already what we see from the Gemara, that David would have thought to first build the temple and only then bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Instead, he's bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and he's going to put it in its own non-temple place. It wasn't on Har Bayit even. It was in the Ir David in its own special tent where, like I said, he built a shrine. And it was only when the temple was dedicated that he united the two. He built the edifice of the temple on Har Moriah, on the Temple Mount. And then it says that Shlomo brought what remained of the Mishkan to the temple and its vessels. And he also brought the Ark of the Covenant to the temple. So this is a little bit out of order. And also it seems unnecessary, Dafka bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. But there's a secret here, and that is that David HaMelech's plan was, and that's why says he consulted not with the Navi in this case. Instead, this is a consultation with other leaders. These are the people in charge and the people who were basically, they were the ones who put him in power. They're the ones who decided that he should be their king. These are the ones with whom he had signed a deal. They basically have power within the respective tribes, and they're going to accept him as their king. His basic idea here was very important, achdut. He was trying to say that if we bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem now, that will be a unifying factor. We were trying to make this a big deal. We're not just going to bring the Ark of the Covenant here. We're going to ask every single Jew we could find. We're going to get the Jews who are even, every Jew remains in Eretz Israel for whatever reason, to come and join us for an amazing event whereby we are going to show that the Ark of the Covenant, even if there is no temple here, and there's not going to be a temple here for a few decades, about 40 years remain until the temple is to be built. He is basically saying we need to put the Ark of the Covenant here because he says we have not sought this out since the times of Saul. This was something that was lacking. This unifying rallying point, the fact that the Ark, just the fact that it's there and we all know about it and we go there to pray. Once again, when it was in storage in Kiryat Yearim, there was no shrine there. There was no service going on there. They didn't have this whole elaborate ceremony, which is a daily thing that David established in Ir David. He basically put a bunch of Levim in charge there to offer sacrifice, as we saw before. That was perfectly permissible. And to have a whole service like Levim, they would sing these psalms that he composed. That was going on every single day. That became a place of prayer. David realized that doing this was a healthy and perhaps, like I say in modern Hebrew, mechazek, it's strengthening. This is something that was good for the combined unity of Am Yisrael, and that's why he chose to do this. And that's what Divrei Yamim is emphasizing. After all, Divrei Yamim, unlike, let's say, the book of Kings and the book of Samuel, the emphasis is the unifying nature of the temple. Divrei Yamim does not consider, for example, the kings of the 10 tribes to have any legitimacy whatsoever, which is why it doesn't really describe them, and why it doesn't say that when, unlike in the book of Kings, when a Davidic king would take the throne, it would tell you in what year of which king of the 10 tribes that happened. In Divrei Yamim, it doesn't mention any of that. It doesn't tell you, it just tells you sometimes how old the particular king was and who his mother was, but doesn't tell you in which year of, let's say, Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, he became king. That's an important point. And that's what Divrei Yamim is getting at. And now the last thing is, because we mentioned these kings of the 10 tribes, we're going to answer, I believe, a question here, which describes Yehu. Yehu basically founded the third dynasty in the 10 tribes. For those keeping score at home, Yerovam ben Nevat, Jeroboam, he was the first king, and he was king for a while, and then his son was assassinated, and that was it. 2 kings on the throne. Son was barely made it for 2 years, and then he was gone. And same thing with his usurper, Baasha, was king for 20-something years, and his own son was assassinated also shortly thereafter, and that gave rise, after some period of unrest, Zimri and Tivni and the rest of them, the people decided that Omri, who was a big shot within Baasha's kingdom, Omri was the best man for the job. Also, Asa Melech Yehuda, according to sages, was also a supporter of Omri. And Omri, as we know, was the father of King Achav. He started the dynasty Achav, and then Achav's two sons, Yehoram and Achaziah, and then Yehoram took the throne until Yehoram was assassinated by Yehu himself. So we had these three dynasties here. And the funny thing is that it says that Yerovam was cursed by God. He was Achia Shiloni said that because Yerovam had decided upon taking the power that he was going to, like I said, the Shitas Yerovam, like the modern Israeli prime ministers, do not let the Jews go to Har Bayit. That was his basic idea. That would harm his political power. So that was a threat. So we don't know any other his political policies or anything like that. What matters is that he did not let the Jews go to Har Bayit. That was his main point, and he created alternatives for them. And Baasha, who was his son's assassin and basically replacement, he did the same exact thing. We don't know what Baasha did differently than Yerovam, but we can imagine that the fact that Baasha was basically allowed by the people to kill Yerovam's son and basically take power and wipe out Yerovam's house, perhaps the people had already grown disenchanted with whatever it is Yerovam was doing, and they liked Baasha and his family more. But in the Navi's eyes, all of that is irrelevant. We know nothing about what they were doing except for the fact that there's one thing that Baasha did like Yerovam, and that was continue this policy of no going to Har Bayit. And the Navi basically said, a later Navi, Yehu ben Hanani, Mil El Hanani, Mil Hanani, he said basically that in God's name, that whatever happened to Yerovam's family was going to happen to Baasha. They were going to be wiped out. Same expressions there, which are quite graphic, describing the elimination of his entire family. That's what happened to Baasha. Now, apparently, Yehu was chosen by God. Eliyahu Navi was described as Elisha Navi also. Yehu was the man chosen to get rid of Achav's family, the third dynasty. And due to Achav, what God had wanted to get rid of them, all of them, and also get rid of the Baal worship that they had introduced to the 10 tribes. And the interesting thing over here that I brought this passage, it says, once Yehu had seized power, God rewarded him for getting rid of the Baal worship. He had done what God had wanted, and his reward was that he was going to have a longer dynasty. B'nai Revi'im Yeshvu L'chal Kisei Yisrael, and that's what happened. His son was Yehoachaz. His son was Yoash. His son was Yerovam II, the greatest of the kings of the 10 tribes, and his son was Zechariah. Zechariah was assassinated and killed, but you see, the prophecy did come true. Yehu's family basically produced 5 kings of Israel who reigned for more than a century. And the question is, wait a minute, Yehu ultimately, it says, he did just as bad as Yerovam. There was no improvement. Yehu and every one of his successors, son after son, was just as bad as Yerovam. They weren't as bad as Omri and Achav and Achaziah and the rest of Achav's family, who they got rid of, but they were just as bad. Now the question is, if Baasha, the founder of the second dynasty in the 10 tribes, is punished just like Yerovam for doing just like Yerovam, for all intents and purposes, continuing Yerovam's policy, how is it that Yehu's family survived? Yes, Zechariah was assassinated, but we do not read anywhere that the Navi came and said your family will be eliminated, or that the assassins, the usurpers, the ones who seized power after Zechariah, eliminated his family. As a matter of fact, I think there's testimony that Yehu's dynasty persisted, at least his descendants persisted among the Israelites, and people knew who they were, even in Second Temple times. They had just lost the throne, that was it, but they did not suffer as much as, let's say, Baasha did. And this is strengthened by the fact that we see in Trei Asar, there's a few things that in the days of Yerovam, Yerovam II, who was Yehu's great-grandson, there was already rumblings that eventually that Yehu's family would be removed for power, and the Demei Yisrael would be recalled upon them, or God would bring it upon whatever it is that they had done wrong. That is, they were now going to be faulted, just like Baasha was faulted for getting rid of Yerovam. So too, Yehu's family would be faulted for getting rid of Achav's family. Yet they were not punished as such. And the question is why? Yes, Yehu was rewarded for getting rid of the Baal, but he still should have received some sort of punishment for continuing in Yerovam's policies. And the answer I propose is Baasha deserved it for continuing after Yerovam, because back then he should have learned the lesson not to do like Yerovam. But let's say a better part of a century later, when Yehu came to power and his family was already chosen by God, so to speak. It had already become something ingrained. The fact that now everybody does like Yeravam initially instituted, that was not something they could now be faulted. Yehu didn't know any better, and neither did his descendants. So then we couldn't fault them as such. So they weren't going to be punished as harshly as Yeravam and Basha and their respective families. And the proof for this is, like I wrote here, the Omerides. We read about that would be Omri and Achav and Achav's two sons who also reigned after him. You look what happens with Achav, I would have expected that just like after Basha took power, sometime afterwards, a Navi came and said that he's just as bad as Yeravam and deserving of elimination. I would have expected Navi to say that to Omri or Achav also. But no such Navi did that. And even though Eliyahu Navi figures very prominently as the permanent adversary of Achav, he never said this to Achav that, yes, they're going to be eliminated like this. Perhaps they would be taken out of power already. Eliyahu Navi was told that Yehu is to be anointed and take Achav's place. But there was no threat, there was no curse put upon Achav's entire house that they would be entirely eliminated. It was only finally pronounced by Eliyahu Navi once Achav had, his wife had orchestrated the death of Navoth through false accusations and a fake trial, and Achav seized Navoth's property, his vineyard. It was only then that Eliyahu Navi pronounced the same prophecy that had been pronounced against Yeravam and Baasha, that his family would be eliminated and the kingdom be given to someone else. So you see then that already in Achav's time and his father's time, following in the waves of Yeravam was no longer saying that God could fault them for to such an extent like he faulted the earlier generations, because this had become ingrained. Like they were tinokot shenishbu, children who were captured and didn't know any better. They never grew up with the right upbringing anyway, so they cannot be faulted for such a thing. That brings us to our conclusion for now. If there's any questions, now's the time. Yoshua, are we there? Did I miss any questions in the chat?
I don't think there are any. Oh, there is a question here actually.
Okay. Okay.
I'm just reading. It's a long question. Just reading it.
Oh, maybe you could put it on the screen here. If I stop the share, would I see it?
Yeah, it's in the chat.
Okay, so I have to find out. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit.
It's about direction of prayer.
I don't see a chat. Where do I find the chat?
So if you move the cursor to the top of the page, now you should be able to see it.
Okay, chat. Okay, here now it shows up for some reason when I share screen. You spoke about not being Porish Benat Tzibur in the beginning of this year. I pray Mincha with the Tzibur at work. We pray outside, but never in direction of the temple for an unknown reason. Sometimes Arabs construction workers notice the prayer taking place. I'm not sure that Arabs know whether we pray in the right direction or not. Anyway, could I be Porish Benat Tzibur and pray in the right direction alone while the others continue to pray in the wrong direction? That's not Porish Benat Tzibur. Doing a little bit different from everybody. Throwing around Porish Benat Tzibur is a terrible thing. I heard that someone actually does halacha, he's a Porish Benat Tzibur. That's a terrible thing. You shouldn't call anybody a Porish Benat Tzibur. That's as bad as calling someone an apikoros or a heretic or some other thing like that. Saying a person, before when I was talking about a person doesn't fast, I'm talking about an emergency. There's a fast day, and this person says, no, I don't need to fast. I don't think that it's such a critical thing right now. That's a bad thing. That's a real prisha. That's a real separating oneself from the community. In this case, just doing halacha, keeping halacha as it should be, is not a prisha minat tzibur. You should actually tell everybody, just to know, Jerusalem is in this direction. It turns out my phone, even unwittingly, has a way to tell me wherever I am, where Jerusalem is, because on the map application, even this I know. See, I'm not such a computer illiterate. The map application has a little icon that shows me on the map which way the phone is pointing. That is, the phone is oriented. It seems to have its own compass, and it shows me where the top of my phone is pointing. If I keep the phone parallel to the ground, basically, and if I could see wherever you're on the map, make that arrow point to Jerusalem, and then I know that my phone is pointing to Jerusalem. See, even you could even do mitzvot with the phone. So you could show everybody where Jerusalem is, and you can use other arguments to indicate where it is, and there's nothing wrong with that. You should always pray Jerusalem if you're playing outside with a group. So you face the right way, and if everybody's doing the wrong way, you should show them which way to pray. And that's not a prisha minat tzibur. And if you're the only one doing it right, there's no such thing. Someone who's doing halacha right is actually guiding the tzibur. He's not separating himself from the tzibur. I hope that, I don't know who asked that question, but I hope that that's sufficient. And he wrote, thanks. Okay, so that's the conclusion. Like I said, everybody learn the halachot. See you in the Beit HaMikdash, and God willing, like the Rambam says, just as we have had the opportunity to pray there in its state of destruction, we should be able to pray there in its when it is reconstructed speedily.
Grossman, can I ask a question, please?
Oh yeah, please. Okay. So I'll give that bracha again at the end.
Okay. What this is quite a sort of a big topic, but what are the Rab's views on the different opinions on the location of Makom HaMikdash?
Location of the Mikdash? I mean, talking about like the actual edifice of the temple?
As in the bits that I mean, my understanding is that the main reason why people, the main reason for the opinion that one can't go onto Har Bayit today is because we don't know where the Makom HaMikdash is, we don't know where the Azara is. And there's different shitot.
There is a few different shitot. They all agree on the basic premise is that there was a temple edifice and that there was the Azara that surrounded it, there was a chil, and all these things were there. Now, like has been pointed out by the map put out by Makbili and his collaborators, it seems very clear where these things were, because the Masechet Midot and also the Rambam describe the various ascensions, how you start at the eastern end of Har Bayit, and in between different areas, there's an ascension, a few steps. The topography of the Temple Mount is still there, and you can still see those various places, and it fits the dimensions described in Midot very, very well. It is very clear today where all these places were. And not only that, the Muslims put their various structures, including the most important one, the Dome of the Rock, on the place where the Jews pointed out to them was the temple. The Jews were going there to pray. They venerated the place like we still today, and they face it. Don't forget, Jews used to be on Har Bayit more often, especially in the early Muslim times before the Muslims prevented them from going there. They were closer to these traditions, and from all sides of Har Bayit, they were facing to one place on the center. That's where they eventually built the Dome of the Rock. So the Dome of the Rock is there. The Radbaz points this out. That's where the temple was. And once we know where the temple was, we know where the walls of the Temple Mount are. We see the various ascensions. It's pretty clear where the Chayil is. It's pretty clear where the what do you call it? The Ezrat Nashim was. There's if I had prepared this before, I think there's a map you could get at the various websites. Like I said, Makbili has it. It's now even available on Wikipedia of all places. And Machon Mikdash and Yeshivat, Har Bayit make these things available. It's very clear where it was. If there ever was doubt, by the way, assuming the most we'll take into account the Achronim who did not have access to all the resources we have now, and just the facts on the ground. Even with then, you have, let's say, Rav Goren's book. You could see that Rav Goren himself said, taken all the different shitot, there are still areas that are very clearly, according to all the shitot, not within the Azaroth, but on Har Bayit. And basically, like the Rambam describes, once you are Tavul Yom at least, you can go to those places. So there's plenty of space where you can go that's still well beyond any safek of being prohibited territory. So there should be no worry, especially if you stay to the perimeter. Yeah, there are people who go closer, but I guess they have confidence, and like I said, their confidence is very well founded, because we see with our own eyes what is going on there. That's sufficient?
Thank you. Yes.
Follow-up question? Okay, good. So once again, I bless everybody that we should see the rebuilding of the temple, God willing, tomorrow, and we'll see you there. Be well.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.